Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final day of this incredible conference, organized, I think, beautifully and executed even more eloquently by a Center for Effective Philanthropy. I am Tiffany Gueye. I have the privilege of serving on the board of directors for CEP and of moderating this morning's panel. As we heard from Phil yesterday, fighting inequality is the #1 most pressing issue among foundation CEOs, as reported in the Future of Foundation Philanthropy. Some of us individually and as institutions have fought this fight for decades. Incremental progress feels insufficient when we find, as we will this morning, that social mobility rates are actually on a sharp decline relative to generations past. This can be discouraging to a social sector leader like me. At my organization, Bell, which is based here in Boston, we serve children in grades pre-K through 8th grade who attend high-poverty schools, whose academic performance suggests they're on a path to failing out or dropping out of school. We invite these students into our programs across the country, and we promise them that their birth is not their fate, that they should forge ahead with conviction, use their agency, and achieve more. Seeing the American dream of social mobility fade is also personally disheartening. Like many of the children I serve through Bell, I grew up poor, eligible for free school lunch, in a community burdened by crime and drug addiction. My grandmother raised my 4 siblings and me in the Four Corners neighborhood of Dorchester here in Boston, on a monthly Social Security check in a 2-bedroom apartment. But I was educated in the wealthy suburb of Dover as part of the state's busing system. I had a world-class K-12 public education experience. Despite the fact that my family faced food insecurity, I went on to earn an advanced degree, to have professional leadership roles, to transform the lives of thousands of children born into poverty, and to start a new generation of my family with greater economic access. My personal story is a story of social mobility. It's very possible. We have to get this right for more children, for all children. I know you share my urgency. More than 2/3 of you reported feeling that foundations can not just make a difference, but make a significant difference in these issues. But when asked the extent to which you're actually making a significant difference, just 13% of you believe that you are. So what will it take? How can we give children from disadvantaged backgrounds better chances of succeeding? This has been the focus of Professor Raj Chetty's work, whose research we will hear about this morning. Raj Chetty is a professor of economics at Stanford University. His research combines empirical evidence and economic theory to help design more effective government policies. His work has been widely cited in media and in congressional testimony. He is a recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal, which is given by the American Economic Association to the best American economist under 40. He will share how big data and new questions are surfacing compelling new insights into mobility and economic opportunity for low-income children, but also how it's identifying potential pathways out of poverty. Following his presentation, we'll hear from a panel of foundation leaders committed to combating the roots and effects of inequality. These are leaders with enormous platforms, savvy leadership, and compelling plans. They include Risa Lavizzo-Mourey, President and CEO of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She's a medical doctor with specialty in geriatrics. Under her leadership, RWJF is focused on building a comprehensive culture of health for all, concentrating on 4 major themes: healthy communities, healthy children, healthy weight, transforming health and healthcare systems, and leadership for better health. We'll also hear from Hilary Pennington. She serves as the Vice President, Education, Free Expression, and Creativity at the Ford Foundation. The Foundation's approach reflects their belief that social movements are built upon individual leadership, strong institutions, and innovative, often high-risk ideas. And we also have with us Kyle Peterson. He's the Executive Director of the Walton Family Foundation, where they're focused on improving K-12 outcomes for all students, protecting oceans, rivers, and communities that depend on them, and improving the quality of life for people living in Northwest Arkansas and the Arkansas and Mississippi Delta region. Please help me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is a pivotal moment in thinking about issues of inequality in the United States. And as I'll talk about today, I think philanthropy can play a really critical role at this time in combating rising inequality and the decline of the American dream. So to motivate what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start at a big picture level by talking about the American dream, which, as you all know, is a multifaceted complicated concept that means different things to different people, but I'm going to distill it here to a simple statistic that we can measure systematically in the data, which is the chance that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap to the top fifth of the income distribution. So think of the classic Horatio Alger version of the American dream. How common is that in the United States versus other developed countries around the world where we have comparable data? So as you can see here, in the US, 7.5% of kids who start out in that bottom fifth end up making the leap all the way to the top fifth. That compares with 9% in the United Kingdom, 11.7% in Denmark, and 13.5% in Canada. Now, initially, when people look at these statistics, they sometimes react by saying, oh, even in Canada, it looks like your odds of success aren't all that high, right? Only 13.5% of kids make it to that top quintile. But you have to remember, of course, that no matter what you do, you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%, right? And so relative to that kind of maximum, the maximum plausible value we would expect the statistic to take is 20%. In a world where your parents played no role at all in determining your outcomes, you'd expect 1/5 of kids from each group to end up in that top fifth. And so relative to that max, these are actually quite large differences in rates of social mobility across countries. One way you might think about it, loosely speaking, is that your chances of achieving the American dream are almost 2 times higher if you're growing up in Canada rather than the United States. Now, these differences across countries have attracted a lot of public attention and have generated a lot of concern that the US may no longer be a land of opportunity, contrary to its traditional billing. But what I'm going to focus on today, and what I think is of greatest interest to all of you, is the fact that upward mobility varies even more within the United States. In recent work with my colleagues, we calculate upward mobility for every metro and rural area in the US, and our work is an application of big data to public policy questions. Much as you hear a lot about how big data is transforming the private sector, companies like Amazon and Google offering new products and better marketing using large data sets. Analogously, our vision is that big data can transform our ability to make policy decisions and make investments that will really transform issues like poverty and mobility. So in this case, we're using anonymous earnings records drawn from tax and social security databases for about 10 million kids, essentially all children born between 1980 and 1982 in the United States. Using that data, we draw this map here, which shows you the geography of opportunity within America. So this map plots the same statistic that I started out with. What fraction of kids who start out in families in the bottom fifth end up reaching the top fifth? And it does so for 740 different metro and rural areas in the US. So we break the US up into these different areas, and we take the set of kids growing up in each of those areas and ask what fraction of the kids who grew up, say, in the Bay Area or in Minneapolis or in Atlanta reach the top quintile of the national income distribution. The map is colored so that lighter colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. So what you can see here, first, if you just look at the scale in the lower right side of this chart, you can see that in the lightest colors of the map, the center of the country, for instance, you have rates of upward mobility exceeding 16.8%, higher than the numbers we saw for Denmark and Canada, for instance. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at places like Atlanta or Charlotte, you have rates of upward mobility below 4.5%, lower than any country for which we currently have data. So even within the United States, there are some places that are truly lands of opportunity, But there are other places that are unfortunately better described as lands of chronic poverty across generations. So in the big map, your eye naturally gravitates to this broad regional variation. The Midwest looks much better than the Southeast, for instance. Parts of the industrial Midwest, like Ohio, have much lower rates of upward mobility. But if you zoom in, and let's take a look here, for instance, at the New York metro area, now looking at the data by county in New York, if you zoom in, you find that there's quite a bit of very local area variation as well. So for instance, if you look at the Bronx, you see 7.3% of kids there rise from the bottom to the top. But if you go over to Queens, that number jumps to 16.8%. So even within narrow geographies, you find the same kind of pattern, looking at the city of Boston versus Cambridge, for instance, really large differences in rates of upward mobility, and similar patterns throughout the United States. So naturally, the question of interest to us as academics and to policymakers and to foundations trying to make a difference in this space is to ask why upward mobility varies so much across areas and what ultimately we might be able to do from a policy perspective to improve mobility in places that currently don't have very good outcomes. So the first point I want to make on this is that the key driver of these differences in upward mobility across the areas that I've been showing you is childhood environment. And the way I'm going to show you that is by talking about a study in which we track 7 million families that move between areas in the United States. And rather than getting into the statistical details of that study, I'm going to summarize what we find with a simple example. So let's say we take a set of families that start out living in Manhattan. And to pick a round number, suppose if you grow up in a low-income family from birth in Manhattan, you're earning $30,000 on average when we measure your income at age 30. Now think about a set of families that move from Manhattan to Queens. And let's say, to pick a round number again, if you grow up from birth in Queens, you earn $40,000 on average when you're age 30. Remember in the maps that I was showing you, Queens seem to have better outcomes than Manhattan or the Bronx, for instance. So now let's think about a set of families that move from Manhattan to Queens with kids of different ages, starting with families who move when their child is exactly 9 years old. Why do we start at age 9? That happens to be the earliest age that we can look at in currently available data. So what we do is take a look at these kids who make this move when they're exactly 9, track them forward 21 years, and measure their incomes when they are 30 years old. And what you can see with this point here on this chart is that those kids end up roughly halfway between the kids who grew up in Manhattan from birth and the kids who grew up in Queens from birth. That is, they're earning about $35,000 when we measure their incomes at age 30. So that's for the kids who move when they're exactly 9 years old. Now let's repeat that analysis, looking at kids who moved when they're 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. And what you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make that move from Manhattan, typically would be a place like Harlem for a low-income family, right, living in Manhattan. The later you make that move, the less of the gain you get. If you move by the time you're in your early 20s, you get essentially no gain at all. And if you move after that point, the relationship is completely flat. So what does this chart show you? I think there are 3 key lessons to take away from it. The first is that place really seems to matter. Where you grow up really matters for kids' outcomes. It's not just that the kids who live in Harlem are different from the kids who live in Queens, or the kids who live in Atlanta are different from the kids who live, say, in San Francisco, which has much higher rates of upward mobility. Apparently, if you take a given child and move that child to a different area, you see very different outcomes for that given child. So that is a really critical result, and I think it's an encouraging result because it shows you that environment really matters and that you can change children's outcomes in a really meaningful way, that you can have an impact on social mobility. It's not just kind of destiny that we can't do anything about. The second key lesson that you see here is that what really seems critical is childhood environment rather than location in adulthood. Moving when you're a young adult doesn't really do much for you. It's about moving when you're a kid that really affects your long-term trajectory. That's very important because a lot of discussions about inequality and mobility tend to focus on things like the labor market and trade and jobs, and I think all of those issues are important, but what you see here is when thinking about this local area variation in the US, it's really about childhood environment. The third thing you see here is that every extra year of exposure to a better environment during childhood matters roughly equally for kids. This is important in light of discussions about early childhood intervention, where we agree that interventions at the earliest stages can have really large returns, so better preschool, for instance. But what you can see in these data is that improving kids' environments, even when they're adolescents, continues to be quite helpful. Moving to a better neighborhood when you're 10 or when you're 15 still has a significant gain relative to moving at a later age. And so I think you shouldn't kind of give up on kids after the youngest ages. Environment continues to matter throughout childhood. So naturally, the next question is to ask, okay, we see that it really matters where you grow up. Why is that the case? Why is it that some places seem to produce much higher rates of upward mobility than others? So we've looked at a variety of different factors to understand that issue. And so in the interest of time, what I'm going to do here is summarize the 5 strongest patterns that we find, the 5 strongest correlations that we find in the data in terms of explaining this variation in upward mobility across places. The first is residential segregation. We find that places that are less segregated by race and by income have significantly higher levels of upward mobility. So there are many different ways to measure segregation. Turns out that it doesn't really matter how you measure it because the patterns are so stark here that you can just see them visually. Let me give you an example. This map depicts racial segregation in Atlanta. The way it's constructed is that each person in Atlanta is represented by a dot, and the dots are colored so that whites are blue, blacks are green, Asians are red, and Hispanics are orange. And you can see immediately, no matter how you measure it, it's completely clear that Atlanta is an incredibly segregated city, where the blue dots and the green dots are just in completely separate parts of the city. Now, cities that look like this, like Atlanta, tend to have the lowest levels of upward mobility in our data. If, in contrast, you look at a city like Sacramento, which has the same minority share as Atlanta, the same fraction of blacks and Hispanics, you see the colors are much more interspersed. And so Sacramento, corresponding to that, and cities that look like this, tend to have some of the highest levels of upward mobility in our data. So that's the first very strong pattern. Residential segregation is strongly negatively associated with rates of upward mobility. Now, the other 5 factors, I'm going to go through them a bit more quickly. We find that places with less inequality within a generation, that is a larger middle class, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility across generations. In a different direction, more from the sociology literature, we find that places with more stable family structures, more 2-parent families and lower divorce rates, tend to have significantly higher rates of upward mobility. This actually turns out to be the single strongest correlation in the data. The number of 2-parent families in an area is an incredibly strong predictor of rates of upward mobility. Related to that, we find that places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. The way I think about the concept of social capital is the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. Will someone else help you out even if you're not doing well? Salt Lake City, with the Mormon Church, is thought to be a classic example of a city with a lot of social capital. And corresponding to that, Salt Lake City and places that look like it, places with a lot of civic participation and religious participation, those kinds of places tend to have the highest rates of upward mobility. Now, social capital is a notoriously difficult thing to measure in the data. And so the concept of social capital was actually popularized by Bob Putnam here at Harvard in a famous book that many of you will know called Bowling Alone, where the reason for the title of that book is Bob used the number of bowling alleys in an area, and in particular whether people were bowling alone, as a proxy for social capital. So I was amazed to find in our own data that the number of bowling alleys is in fact a very strong predictor of differences in upward mobility across areas. The reason I mention that to you here is that it illustrates a caveat to everything that I'm showing you in this slide, which is that these are correlations rather than causal effects, right? I'd be surprised if the lesson from this is that we should build more bowling alleys to try to revive the American dream. And so, the way you want to take this list is not that it literally tells you what you need to do in order to improve mobility, it's that it gives you a sense of what factors are most important. The 5th factor, which is intuitive, better education, both at the K through 12 level and in terms of higher education, We show a correlational relationship in the analysis I'm describing here, but more broadly, there's a lot of research showing that there are important causal effects of improving the quality of education, both at the primary school level and in higher education, on long-term outcomes. So what I'm going to do in the last few minutes is summarize our most recent work on these issues, which focuses specifically on the role of higher education in upward mobility as one particular angle where I'll go into more depth. Just to be clear, this is not because I think higher education is the most important thing or the only important thing on the list that I just showed you. It's one of various issues that we're investigating, and this gives you a sense of how we're going into these issues in further detail. So, as you all know, higher education is widely thought to provide a pathway to upward mobility. However, relatively little is known about which specific colleges contribute the most to upward mobility within the US, because we've lacked data on the income distributions of parents and students at each college in America. So what we do in this most recent paper released a couple of months ago is construct publicly available mobility report cards for every college in America. The way we do that is by using attendance and income data on all college students from 1999 to 2013 from the Department of Treasury and the Department of Education. So that's about 30 million students who attended college over that period. So I'm going to show you what we find by just going through a couple of examples that illustrate the key patterns. So let's start with this chart here, which shows you the income distribution of parents of students at Harvard. The way this is constructed is you see one bar for each of the 5 income quintiles. So for instance, about 3% of kids at Harvard come from the bottom fifth of the income distribution, 70% come from the top fifth of the income distribution. What is even more striking than that, I think, is that 15.4% of kids at Harvard come from families in the top 1%. That's families making more than about $600,000 a year. So there are more kids at Harvard coming from families in the top 1% than the entire bottom 50% of the income distribution. That's true not just of Harvard, but all the other Ivy League schools and other top schools in the United States, such as Stanford. You see a very similar pattern. So to give you another example of that, this shows you the parent income distribution at Columbia. You see a very similar pattern with a much larger fraction of kids from very high income families relative to the lower parts of the income distribution. So that shows you one side of the mobility equation, the parent income distribution. Let's now look at kids' outcomes, which is the other piece of thinking about intergenerational mobility. So this line here shows you the fraction of kids at Columbia who reach the top quintile of the income distribution based on their parent income level. So you can see that at Columbia, roughly 60% of kids make it to the top income quintile in their mid-30s. And what I think is quite important and interesting about this is that this looks completely flat across the parent income distribution. So conditional on going to Columbia, kids from low-income families and high-income families do just about as well as each other. That's really important because people in the higher education space have often been worried that maybe we can try to get more low-income kids into elite colleges like Columbia, but maybe they'll struggle there and not be able to do as well because they haven't had the same preparation and so forth. I think quite encouragingly, this shows that in fact, the kids who are getting into these schools, we find this pattern not just at Columbia, but elsewhere as well, they do just about as well as kids from more affluent backgrounds. So I think that kind of mismatch concern is not really an issue in practice. So let's now compare Columbia to another institution in New York, State University of New York, Stony Brook. And what I think is striking about the Stony Brook comparison is that the outcomes at Stony Brook look almost as good as at Columbia. About 55% of kids make it to the top income quintile. But Stony Brook, if you look at the bars showing you the parent income distribution, has many more low and middle income kids than Columbia does. And so if you put those two pieces of information together, you can see what that means is Stony Brook is taking a lot more kids from poverty and helping them reach the top part of the income distribution than Columbia is, right? So Columbia has fantastic outcomes like Harvard, but when you have a very small fraction of low-income kids, naturally you cannot be, in an accounting sense, contributing that much to mobility because you don't have that many low-income kids to begin with. Stony Brook, in contrast, has quite a substantial low-income population, and lots of those kids end up in the top quintile. So more generally, you can ask, what are the colleges in America that move the most kids from the bottom to the top of the income ladder. And so this chart here summarizes shows you the top 10 colleges in America by their bottom to top quintile mobility rate. That is, in terms of the total number of kids, they move from the bottom fifth to the top fifth of the income distribution. You can see at the top of the list is Cal State Los Angeles. You have Stony Brook third on this list. So just to help you interpret these numbers, what does the 9.9% for Cal State LA mean? It means that if you take 100 kids at Cal State LA, roughly 10 of them started out poor and ended up rich. 10 out of those 100 moved from the bottom fifth to the top fifth. Some of the other places, the City University of New York, Glendale Community College in Los Angeles, Cal State Poly Pomona, and so forth. So you can see the types of schools here are kind of these mid-tier public schools. It's not the flagship public schools, not the Berkeleys and University of Michigan Ann Arbor. Those schools actually do not show up near the top of these lists because they have relatively few low-income kids. It's more of the second-tier public schools that really seem to have the best outcomes. Let me show you one final piece of data on how this picture is changing over time. So, as you all know, there have been a lot of changes in the higher education space, efforts to try to increase access at top private schools, budget cuts at public institutions that might have had adverse effects, and so forth. So let's start by looking at some of the elite private schools that have had substantial initiatives in this space to try to increase low-income access. So here, we're plotting the fraction of kids from low-income families, from the bottom quintile at Harvard over time. And as you might know, at Harvard, tuition was essentially made free for families earning less than $60,000 or $80,000 starting around 2006. And you can see that there's a little bit of an uptick in the fraction of kids from low-income families, but not a dramatic change. If you look at Stanford, which made a similar change in 2007, the line is essentially flat. What is a much bigger trend in higher education in the United States is this. If you look at places like Stony Brook and Glendale Community College, the kind of mid-tier public schools that were on the top of the mobility rate list that I just showed you, those places have substantially declining fractions of kids from low-income families over the past 15 years. So take a look at Stony Brook, for instance. Roughly 1 in 5 kids, 20% of kids, came from a poor family in 2000, but by 2011, that had fallen by almost a factor of 2 to only 10% of kids coming from low-income backgrounds. And so what that means is Stony Brook was traditionally a very high mobility rate school, was providing a pathway for lots of kids to rise from the bottom to the top. And because of tuition increases or whatever else, we don't know exactly what the reason is yet, the fraction of low-income kids at Stony Brook and other places like that has declined substantially. And I think that is quite worrisome for those working in the higher education space and thinking about that as a channel to create upward mobility. So let me end by talking about what I see as an agenda for trying to improve economic opportunity and reverse some of these trends going forward, both at a broad level and in terms of what we're doing within our research group, so you have a concrete sense of where things are headed in the research community. So the first broad lesson I'd take away from the set of results I've been showing you is that we should think about addressing inequality not just at the national level, but at a local level. And especially, I think, given the current state of affairs in DC, where it's difficult to get policy action on issues like this, I think this is an encouraging thing for people in foundations. You can really do something in terms of local governments, colleges, and so forth. Given the amount of variation we're seeing in the data across places, I think you can think about this from the perspective of sort of precision medicine for poverty. Use granular data to target low opportunity areas, certain cities, neighborhoods within cities, and so forth, in order to customize solutions that can work. In our ongoing work, in order to facilitate that sort of approach, we're building new data sets to map opportunity, health, and other outcomes by zip code and census tract. A second broad message I would take from this is that you should focus on improving childhood environments rather than just issues of the labor market. And this is, I would emphasize, not just about spending more money. The US already spends more on education, for instance, than other countries like Scandinavian countries that have much better outcomes. It's about targeting that money and targeting resources, I think, at institutions that seem to deliver good outcomes. And so in our ongoing work, we're studying how to identify and increase access to high-performing colleges, in particular, places like the City University of New York. What are they doing right? How can we maintain access at those places? How can we replicate their outcomes elsewhere? A third broad lesson that I take from these data is that while many of us have the instinct of focusing on traditional levers like schools or healthcare, things like that, my sense from looking at these data in various ways is that things like social norms and aspirations and networks matter quite a bit as well. So, broadly, you might think about how can we create more connected communities. We see that social capital seems to be an important predictor. That's all about connections and somebody else helping you out, giving you information, and so forth. As social scientists, we haven't been able to study those issues in a very precise way. One of the things we're doing in our ongoing research is studying specifically how networks affect poverty and well-being across areas using data from Facebook, which gives us unprecedented information on networks, much sharper than what we've had in the past. And finally, at the broadest level, as I hope I've shown you here, I think it can be really valuable to harness big data to develop a scientific evidence base for economic and social policy. So to facilitate that, in our group, all of the data that I've been showing you in this presentation by county and by college is publicly available for people to use on this website, equalityofoportunity.org. More broadly, our vision going forward is to try to set up what we're thinking of as an opportunity institute that will use big data to directly help local actors increase upward mobility based on empirical evidence. Let me end with this slide here, which shows you why I think this is a critical time in the nation's history to act on these issues. What this chart plots is the fraction of kids who earn more than their parents at a comparable age, a traditional way of measuring the American dream. Are you doing better than your parents did when you're, say, 35 or 40 years old? And so what you can see here is we're plotting the fraction of kids who earn more than their parents based on the year in which they're born. So that first dot there shows you that for kids born in 1940, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of doing better than your parents. 92% of kids born in 1940 did better than their parents did, adjusting for inflation. If you fast forward to kids who are about 30 today, kids who were born in the 1980s, that number has become 50%. It's essentially a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream today. So I think this trend, it underlies much of the frustration that we're seeing across America today. And I see it as one of the defining challenges of our time, and I hope that we'll be able to work together to revive the American dream. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we want to hear from the panel, some reactions. We will have time also for questions from you all. We're going to leave a few minutes at the end for that. So if you do have questions, please write them down, and I promise to get to you. But if we want a more just distribution of mobility opportunities, what role can philanthropy play? So Kyle, I'll start with you. What is the role of philanthropy in this, and how is the Walton Family Foundation approaching it?
Well, it's a big question. It's great to be here, and thank you so much, Dr. Chetty, for that. It's sobering and humbling. I guess the first comment I have, and I wasn't even thinking about this until listening hard to this is a big responsibility. I'm brand new. I just took this job 6 months ago, and I used to be an advisor to foundations. That was easy. That was easy. Now I've got the responsibility to do stuff with massive resources. So, I sit up a little bit taller in my chair every day thinking about these things, and your last chart, really has impact. So I think, one thing to say is that this is all, it is humbling. But I think for our foundation, I've taken a lot of time, I think, first to get to know some of the central values of the family. And I think that's the North Star. I mean, the programmatic work flows from whatever the values are of the board and the family and wherever the genesis of the resources came from. And I've had the great fortune of talking to many of the Walton family members in both generations about issues around economic, educational opportunity, and how this leads to social mobility. And this really was at the heart of what I've been learning, at the heart of what Sam and Helen wanted to do when they started this foundation. And I see it with other family members as well. And we're going through a process right now. One of the first things I wanted to do was to kind of relook at our mission, vision, and values, and we're bringing this back. So we're actually having a conversation about this right now, the sort of North Star and the importance of economic and educational opportunity. And I think that's the guide for how those resources are used. I think, programmatically for us, where this touches, it really touches our 3 different areas, and I don't want to spend too much time, but I think profoundly in our K-12 work, and your last of your 5 kind of key areas there, this is about the quality of schools. And in our K-12 work, the foundation, really since the time of John Walton, who passed away about 10 years ago, has had a focus on trying to improve, create a diversity of very high-performing schools across the country. And what we've been doing over the last couple of years is really focusing in on about a dozen cities and going deeper. So, really tracking with Dr. Chetty's research, focusing in on the school, focusing in on specific areas, and really trying to grow a diversity of very high-performing schools in places like New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and Indianapolis, and others. And we believe when you've got great performing schools, hopefully you can create an ecosystem where more schools are kind of follow that lead. But that's not enough. And the more we learn about this, and before I came in, I was impressed because the foundation had made a pivot, which was important as I sort of learned about the work. And that is, you can have high-performing schools, but the environment around the schools matters a lot, obviously. That's a no-brainer. But what to do in that myriad ecosystem of issues? So we're focusing in on things like transportation, because if kids can't get to high-performing schools, it doesn't matter how good those schools are. Or if parents don't have information, which would then lead them, if they had the ability to go to great schools, to lead them to know which schools are high-performing. Or even working with parents so that they have a voice in determining what kind of schools they want. So the second piece of this from us, really tracking with your research beyond the schools, is the environment. And I think a third area that we're focusing in on is really looking at the leaders of schools. And we've been a supporter of Teach for America, for example, for more than 10 years. But I think the more and more we learn, and I love the fact, and I'm pushing this even more to learn as fast as we can, is we have to grow leaders of these great schools in the locations where they are, and representative of the communities of those schools. So we are working with many grantees, like the Surge Institute, for example, Camelback Ventures, working to identify great school leaders who are from those communities. Again, that's kind of that focus as the school as a key ingredient in educational opportunity leading to social mobility. And we're learning. And as I kind of, at my end here, I'm looking forward. I'm a big collaborator, and I think our strategy is very sound. But to take on the task that you're talking about, it's going to require dramatic collaboration. I'm excited to begin that.
That's great. So Kyle's at the beginning of this. There's already quite a bit of alignment with what Raj would prescribe, which is great. Risa, you've been a leader in this sector, and you've had some strategies underway for quite some time. You're not at the beginning. In fact, you're at a different place professionally. What have you seen then over this period of time that you've been leading RWJF? But in particular, what do you see more broadly as the role of philanthropy in this?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for your personal story. I think it set a context that was very important. And Raj, your work is tremendous. It's always a pleasure to hear what you have to say in a different spin on it. It's great to be here with my panelists. I would start by just reminding everyone that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, of course, is a health foundation. So as we think about this, we try to put a lens of health on it. And so let me just make 5 points relatively quickly. The first is I take from Raj's work and from what health and imply what health philanthropies can do is that poverty or lack of mobility is bad for your health. I think if you were to show a slide of where you see some of the worst health outcomes in the country, it would overlay pretty dramatically what you showed in terms of mobility across the country and probably even at the local level, which means that we've spent a lot of time trying to define what health equity means and how to invest in health equity. And there are a lot of definitions, but the one that I heard yesterday from someone who spoke at the foundation that was just very eloquent and I'll be using in the future is we're trying to help people redefine a vision for themselves and their communities and then give them the tools to make it happen. So focusing on health equity has become a big part of what we do. I think philanthropy can look at the local level, and as you have defined the importance of health equity and health outcomes at a local level. We've been describing work at the zip code level and coining the phrase that your zip code is as important as your genetic code in determining your health outcomes. To put it in a way that people can really understand it and start to think about how they can make changes in their own communities. When I look at what Raj presents, it's very clear that we're talking about systems that have been failing for a long time and multiple systems that have been failing. So as philanthropy, we can't really focus in on just one area. We've got to look across education and housing and economic opportunity and the social systems that create that social capital. And you can't do that without working across sectors. And so I think an important lesson for philanthropy is that you've got to look beyond the sector that you're most comfortable working with and create opportunities to work across sectors. And then just 2 other quick points. We talk a lot about taking things to scale and transforming systems and so on. And that brings us to what is the unit of transformation? And of course, it's going to be at different levels, but I think we have to recognize that the unit of transformation starts locally. And if we can't get to the level of trying to provide the kind of data and tools at a local level to create that social capital and engagement, we are probably not doing our job. And then finally, I don't really have an answer how to do it, but this point of creating more social connectedness and engagement is absolutely essential. You showed that slide of a downward mobility. We could show the same slide of life expectancy, and so often it is correlated with how well people have a sense of shared community, shared value for health. So I think that that's the 5th area that we've got to invest in as philanthropy. So I'll stop there. Turn it to you, Hilary.
Great. Hilary, it would be great to hear from you next. There are so many barriers, as we heard from the research, but that we've experienced, and Ford Foundation is additive even to what Walton and RWJF are doing in that you have areas of grant making and work in the world that are even different. Tell us how you think philanthropy plays a role.
Well, just echoing thanks to all of you. First of all, I think just let's be real. I think philanthropy has a special obligation to work on inequality because it created us, right? The market system that allows people to build enormous wealth, that lets them create endowed philanthropies. So I think that's a special obligation of our sector, and I think we've been hearing really important and valuable ways philanthropy can think about changing how it acts, including partnering much more aggressively and intentionally with each other, not just across issue areas, but local, state, and national and international funding. So the Ford Foundation, as many of you know, made a special commitment to have inequality be our guiding focus for everything that we do. And we're an 80-year-old foundation. We've worked on social justice issues our entire life. But changing that focus has changed way more than we anticipated that it would. In how we think about how change happens, what we fund, and who we fund, how we think about who we fund. In the sort of how we think about change happens, we were a foundation that spent a lot of our early years funding something that remains extremely valuable, sort of proof points, demonstrations, and evidence. But we've come to realize over the years that people believe the evidence that supports what they believe already. And evidence is not as powerful as we would all wish it would be in creating change. So increasingly over the years, we have, and particularly now with this focus on inequality, we've had to ask ourselves, so what causes inequality to perpetuate itself? And for us, we have made a choice that we'll focus on underlying structures of beliefs and systems. So we focus a lot on sort of the rules of the game, predatory lending. We don't fund financial literacy, but we look a lot at how predatory lending works as an example. We focus a lot on the minimum wage and family leave kinds of policies. We do and have stayed very focused on systems change, so systems like the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, education. Raj's research has actually been very important and helpful for us. One of the very interesting things we're funding is an alliance between, and a number of other foundations here, Kresge and Gates I know fund this as well, an alliance between 11 state universities like Arizona State, Georgia State. They're not yet in your top 10, but they've formed together an alliance to get to that top 10. They've said, as regional institutions, public institutions, our mission and our mandate is to change those lines that Raj showed us on this chart. And they are focusing maniacally on 5 kinds of interventions: student supports, how they use their financial aid, how they structure the academic experience for students, to get better at enrolling and graduating low-income and underrepresented populations from their regions. And in the 2.5 years that they've been working together, they've already doubled the numbers of those kinds of students that they are graduating. So that, what you would want to see in a great institution like higher education is that kind of maniacal focus on changing those lines. And I spoke at a conference of higher education leaders the other week, and I used Raj's data to explain why the foundation was no longer going to be focusing on building departments or even creating centers that focus on inequality, but would be turning our efforts much, much more on things like this Innovation Alliance. And then we focus a lot on trying to understand underlying power dynamics and belief systems. We're funders of Black Lives Matter. We do a lot of funding in education and creativity and free expression. We've been doing, and trying to push the envelope on how people hear stories and whose stories they get to hear. How can we create much more art and expression by voices from the margins? And we've been funding Halal in the Family, a set of documentaries, for example, on the secret lives of Muslims, trying to lift up and put those kinds of voices more centrally in our cultural dialogues. But last, and probably the most important change that we've made, is to realize that this kind of work that we do, social justice work, is a long game. And almost for every win you get, there is a pushback against that win. And so the single most important thing we can do is to help our grantee partner organizations be strong and durable and resilient organizations. And we've made a commitment, $1 billion commitment over 5 years, to work with key grantee partners to give them 5-year core support to help them make themselves more resilient and more adaptive, so that when pushback happens, they don't have to wait for a foundation to decide what's in their strategic, focus area, but they can move themselves to take adaptive action. And we're making 5-year commitments to each of the organizations at least the same amount as Ford has funded them in the past, or ideally more. And we're encouraging them to use that to build up their foundations, their reserves, what they pay people and what kinds of benefits they give them, whether they have a pipeline for leadership. Far too many organizations that we fund are ready to make a generational change, but they haven't built a pipeline of diverse leadership for their futures. So those are things that our focus on inequality. And then we have also made a very particular focus to try to make sure that a very large number of the organizations that we fund are led by women and people of color. So the who we fund is something that has changed by our commitment and our focus on inequality. So there are some of the kinds of things that we're working on, and we're learning and partnering, and we have a long way still to go.
Thank you. And while we're talking about Ford, if I can ask, as you think about grant making globally and domestically, and we heard from Raj, there are some communities in the US that have lower mobility rates than any other country in the world for which we have data. How do you think about that tension with your grant making?
That's a long existing tension with the Ford Foundation. We're a global foundation. We spend 60% of our resources here in the US, 60% of our grant making, 40% internationally. We are not changing that. But we are looking increasingly at how we can use our grant making to build networks of people across the world who work on these kinds of issues. So an example, we're making a big investment in trying to fund, develop, and connect young social justice leaders who are working on issues that matter to them and to their communities, things like college debt or quality of schools, criminalization, and thinking about how do we build not just their voice and agency, but their power and their skill. How do we connect them with economists, with researchers, with politicians, and how could we link them across the world? So we're trying to think about actually what our global footprint gives us as an advantage. But it's a very lively tension. Our regional offices don't think we should spend less money in the global south.
Yeah. Something else you said, Hilary, brings me to a question for you, Raj. You said evidence is not as powerful as we'd like it to be in creating change. What's the role of academia? And in particular, how are you thinking about creating opportunities for change specifically through your research? Where do you see the opportunities? Some of this we knew, some of this are new insights. But how does this translate into actually real work happening, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right that traditionally it's been difficult to translate evidence into policy. I would say partly because the nature of evidence in the past has been much more diffuse than the very precise kind of things we're able to do now. So the type of data I've been showing you here by college or by specific neighborhood 5 years ago did not exist and would have been very difficult to construct because we didn't have these types of data sets, didn't have the computing architecture to be able to do this kind of quite computationally intensive work where you're using billions of observations in many cases to construct these types of data. And so I really think this is a unique time to be able to zoom in to local areas, to local actors, and make a change that will have an impact on a national scale. I think if you just take that last chart I showed about declining national trends and rates of social mobility, it seems like kind of a daunting challenge, as you noted, Kyle, and it's humbling, and it's like, how am I going to reverse that with the specific thing that I'm working on? But when you then look at the local area breakdown, it seems like something that's more tractable in terms of, you can look at Arizona State and try to have an initiative there. That is going to be a piece towards contributing towards the broader reversal. I think that as we have more of this data available, what we're finding in our work is there are lots of local public governments, housing authorities, for example, in the context of the neighborhood work I was showing, colleges, that are very interested in using these data to figure out how they can make better investments. And so I think an important role for philanthropy to potentially play is to facilitate that connection between this type of research output and the application of that data in the public policy space. So we find in our research team, for example, that we put out all this data and we get lots of emails from housing authorities around the country that say, we see this neighborhood looks much better. We want to figure out how we can send our voucher holders there as opposed to some other place, or we want to invest in this neighborhood instead of that neighborhood. It is very difficult as researchers to support all of that work, but that strikes me as an opportunity that would really have concrete impact and would make that connection between evidence and policy much, much more effective.
One thing I love about your evidence, it's just, it also subverts established beliefs. You've communicated it and structured it in a way that challenges people about things that we believe and shows them in a very granular way that it's not true. And that, I think, is hugely powerful.
Can I just
Risa,
pick
please.
up on that? Because I think you make an incredibly important point, and one that we've learned by releasing data at the county level for now 5 or 6 years that showed differences in health and the factors that lead to health in counties. And what we've learned is that it's not granular enough. People need much more granular data, and so we're trying now to give data at the census tract level in 500 cities around the country, many of them small cities that are really grappling with how to make these changes. But your point that you need the analytic power, getting the data helps, but what these places are going to need is the ability to analyze it and see the impact of interventions that they're making across these various sectors much more in real time. And I think that marrying those two capabilities is something that as philanthropy we can invest in much more heavily.
I have a couple more questions for the panel, but I will allow time for questions from you all if you have them. So it'd be useful to know if you have a question, please, there are 2 microphones here in the middle of the room, one closer to the stage and one farther behind. If you have a question, please feel free to make your way to that microphone so that we'll know you have a question, and we'll continue here. But please start making your way there if you do have a question for the panel. So you just mentioned, Risa, the need for more granular data and more analytic capability, and I think many of us have observed that need across many sectors. And there are sometimes things we know. There is evidence of what works, despite even not having enough evidence of what works. Do you think our country has a gap or tension between skill and will? Are we scaling up the things we know that work? Why not?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. I think we have a model of what it takes to scale something up that may be a little antiquated. That's one. And secondly, I think we have not done enough to understand and learn from what some social scientists have called positive deviance. When we look in the health area, there are some communities that are doing a great job of improving the health in their community. And we haven't tried to understand what they're doing and help them learn from each other. The foundation recently funded the National Academy of Medicine to look at these kinds of communities, and they've learned a few things. None of them are really surprises. It takes leadership, and not necessarily the charismatic kind of leadership that we all think about. It takes data, and data that they can use in a real-time way. They need to understand the things that are really important to the people that they're working with, and that means the people who are in the community have to be integrally involved. They need to have governance structures that make sense for how to create alliances across sectors, and importantly, they have to have creativity and a commitment to sustainability. And the sustainability isn't about money so much as it's about, in a lot of ways, the social capital that pulls those people together. So I think we can use these kinds of ways of understanding what's really working on the ground to think about a different kind of scaling that isn't linear, but is networked and probably involves policy change, of course at the federal level where we're all used to thinking about it, but also at the very local level as well, getting people to understand what are the policies that have specifically led to racial segregation in housing and what can be done to reverse those. So I think that, yes, we've got to think differently about our work if we're really going to make an impact.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Can I just quickly add on to that? I think one of the most interesting things in the social sector over the last 10 years has been a recognition and a pivot that you got to focus on the demand side. I think the social sector has traditionally around the world been fantastic at the supply side, coming up with the ideas, coming up with the institutions, but relatively weak, uninformed, not very well skilled at behavioral issues, behavioral economics in particular. There's a change. I think everybody in the room probably has been paying attention to this, and I think some of your great research lends itself to this. But we really have to understand deeply, what communities want, what individuals want, right? And sort of get our hands around the demand notions of this before we start our work and as we're working. And so I think it's the demand and the supply at the end of the day.
Yeah, and while you're mentioning that, and then I'll come to you, as we all are more aware than we were previously, the needs of middle America and rural communities are different than I think we were assuming, and we were not giving, I think, the right attention. What have your insights been thus far in your work in Arkansas?
That's the coolest part of my job. You know, I'm spending a lot of time in the central time zone. You know, we're based in Bentonville, Arkansas, and I invite everybody to come. It's a cool place to live. It's not rural. It's not urban, it's somewhere in between, but I think the sensibility of the foundation has a focus on rural America, which is something which I'm not sure was really even it's sort of left out. I'm not so sure how it fits into this conversation, because a lot of the data, I imagine, comes from urban areas. So we definitely focus in on rural areas. I was just in Indiana last week, in farming country, and one of the areas that we focus on is the Mississippi River. And we're looking at the water health in the Mississippi River and the dead zone that exists in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, lo and behold, where does all the nitrogen that actually is creating that dead zone, where does it come from? Farms in Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And we're trying to help small farmers in particular improve soil health, reducing the use of fertilizers which contribute to that horrible dead zone. And so I get to work with small farmers and think about how do you scale some of these really, which are not very new. They're traditional ideas like cover crops. I also spend time in the Arkansas and Mississippi Delta. I don't know if folks have been there. I had never been there before. This is not the wetlands down in New Orleans. This is, about an hour and a half south of Memphis in Arkansas and Mississippi. And the foundation has been focused there for 25 years. And it's about the poorest area I've ever been to in the United States. And we're focused on education, we're focused on economic development, and we've made some progress, but it is tough. And this is a great example, again, where I think it's really important to collaborate. The Ford Foundation has certainly been there, Rockefeller Foundation has been there. And we need to work together, because I think the issue again becomes, how do we focus on the leaders who are there to improve their capabilities? Because if not, if we just come in with ideas, we're never going to solve, the real fundamental problem that's there. So I'm asking a lot of questions in that area in particular.
Yeah. Hilary?
Just to add on your question about skill and will, what I love and think is so powerful is all the things that you were talking about, what we know, and how much more granular we are able to know and how much more focused we are on feedback loops. But I still think we have to couple that with a will problem. And I think the biggest, hardest problem of will is what we heard Brian Stevenson talking about the other night, which is that we still don't, we don't want the resources to go to helping them, the people that are not us. And so I think how we figure out how to show and shift beliefs so that people in the country understand that what happens to people that are not them also is essential for them and our entire mobility. That societies that are divided against themselves, that have the kinds of inequalities you're documenting, are not healthy societies. They don't stay democratic societies. They don't have economic growth. And that, I think, is a much harder thing that philanthropy also needs to think about and try to be helpful on.
Yeah. Raj.
I can just quickly add to all those excellent comments on your question on skill and will. So people often ask about scaling up, and there's this view of let's demonstrate that something works in one place and then scale this up on a much broader level, right? And so my view on that, from spending quite a bit of time thinking about these issues, if you take a concrete example like charter schools, for instance, in your space, Kyle, people often ask, do charter schools work? If so, can we just scale this up and use this throughout the country? And what you find when you look at the data is some charter schools are really good, some charter schools actually look significantly worse than public schools in terms of outcomes. And so often scaling doesn't work because the quality of implementation is absolutely critical and often changes as you're scaling. And so that, I think, comes back to all of the themes you've been talking about, that the granular data and the focus on what works in a particular place is extremely important. Second, on the issue of will, I think in thinking about issues of inequality, I found it very useful to frame the discussion around opportunity rather than inequality, and I find that to be a way to bring people together much more than talking about inequality, which has the feel of redistribution, there are winners and losers. I think when you think about it from the perspective of opportunity, it starts to become clearer that you can help a group succeed benefiting the nation as a whole, rather than viewing this as a zero-sum game where you're dividing a fixed pie.
Yeah. Let's hear some questions. If you could both ask your questions in succession, and then we'll have the panel address them, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. This is Jody Hoffer-Gattel, Brandeis University and Endowment for Health. I guess just building on where the conversation is going, particularly Hilary's comment from Ford, seems like there are two fundamental ways to understand inequality. One is about the structure of opportunity, and the other is more about the sorting mechanisms that are either fair or unfair in sorting people across that structure of opportunity. And it seems like the mobility conversation, particularly at the beginning, is more about how do we fairly sort people into those different opportunities that are out there, whether it's through social capital, education, and so on. But it seems like we'll also want to address, and I'd love to hear how philanthropy can best address the underlying structure of opportunity, which, as we know, has been decimated in the U.S. Over the last, particularly since the 70s, as the share of wealth held by the top 1% has risen back to about the levels prior to the Great Depression. So if you think about the inequality for all and the kind of evidence behind that, it's been a shift in the structure of opportunity and the size of the middle class. So.
Great.
Some of the things we're talking about can really address both the sorting and the underlying structure of opportunity, but I just wonder from that standpoint, where do we think philanthropy can be most effective?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Renee Wizik-Barrios, Greater Houston Community Foundation. Raj, I think I heard you say that the biggest predictor for childhood environment was stable family relationship. And I'm really curious about that because that seems as though that is going to be something incredibly difficult to address. And a lot of it may have to do with criminal justice reform and how many men are incarcerated. But I'm really curious from you and from the panelists if anyone is seeing any promising practices in that area. And I just think that's an incredibly challenging situation. So curious about that.
Great. And it looks like that brings us our sort of ultimate questions here because we're running out of time, but maybe you want to address that last question and then as part of a closing remark, maybe address the first question and help wrap up in whatever way you'd want to add some insight for us. Thank you.
So let me take the question about family structure. So you heard that right, that the fraction of single parents is one of the strongest predictors of differences in mobility across areas. So areas with more two-parent families have higher levels of mobility. There's a very important nuance to that that's important to understand, which is it doesn't appear to be about literally whether your own parents are married or not. And the way that you can see that is if you look at the subset of kids whose own parents are married, if they are growing up in a community with a lot of single parents, they're less likely to climb the income ladder. So that shows you it's not literally about whether you yourself are growing up in a two-parent family or a single-parent family. That seems to matter somewhat. But what's driving those spatial patterns is something at the community level that's different about communities with a lot of single parents versus two parents. And so that leads you to solutions that could involve things like thinking about criminal justice and how you create more stable families. But it also suggests that it's more broadly about issues like social capital and stable community structures. And so this is part of the reason we're trying to think more about networks and how you create that kind of stability. So I don't think you should interpret that too literally as how do we get more people to be married. I think that's a piece of the puzzle, but it's again coming back to the community level types of issues that everyone has been discussing.
That's a great question, and that was great clarification. Thank you. And in my experience, a strong-willed grandma trumps all scenarios. Find one of those. So the first question was about distribution of opportunity versus structure of opportunity. So to the extent you can or want to, as part of your remarks, that'd be great to hear from you, each.
I'll just make a couple of comments. One of the things that I think we have to ask ourselves is what we can learn about creating those new kinds of opportunities in places where people are feeling the most left behind. And we're seeing, I think, across the country that in many smaller cities, there's been a tremendous disinvestment, and yet people still are they know each other in small cities. I've been to Little Rock and some of the places that you were talking about in Arkansas. The wealth gap is not as great as it is in other places. And I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves and try and learn is whether we can create more of the tools and opportunities to transform opportunity in those places for the future. So that's one of the areas that RWJ is working on. And then I think on the public policy, I've been intrigued by this notion of the two-family stable families and what we can do from a policy perspective to make changes in that area. I had the opportunity to hear Raj on a panel with J.D. Vance, who's written about the experience in Appalachia. And one of his recommendations from a policy perspective is that we have policies that invest in extended communities, extended families' ability to support each other. And so your example, Tiffany, of your grandmother doing it all on her Social Security check because there wasn't a policy perspective that enabled her to have greater resources, really spoke to the kind of examples that he was giving from a policy perspective. And lastly, I would just say there's not going to be one solution. We've got to really be willing to look much more broadly, and I emphasize across sectors if we're going to crack this.
I'll pick up that note. I think if we're going to, one of the messages of your research, Raj, is that we have to go deeper. Right, we have to go more local. And none of us on the stage have the resources across the board on all these issues if we're going to be going local and more deeper. So this really is coming back to the issue of coordination and collaboration, not just talking about it. So we were chatting before this regarding our work in the Mississippi River that's connected to many farms in the 3 states I mentioned. And lo and behold, what's very important, what is I'd say a key to success in terms of the quality of the water in the Mississippi is the Farm Bill. Now, the Farm Bill is something that a number of folks in here are involved in. You're involved in that from a nutrition perspective.
Kyle, could you put your microphone a little closer to your mouth, maybe?
Yeah.
Chair 4.
Alex saved the day. Thank you.
There we go. Sorry. So I think the Farm Bill is an example of something where we need to coordinate on. I think the issue really here is none of us have the resources to tackle these problems, this sort of the foundations of these issues well. We have to stay focused, but really that I think increases the responsibility for better coordination.
That's great.
Well, I very much agree with what everyone said, and I think one thing philanthropy is not so great at is both and thinking. So we have to, and we're a very broad sector, and we can work on different things. I do think that rules matter. What do we have minimum wage? Do we have paid family leave? There are a handful of kinds of rules that would make it so much easier for all the other kinds of things that you were talking about to happen and take hold. So I think those are also important to pay attention to. It's not just the miraculous things that individuals can do or families and communities can do. And then I think also movements matter, and pressure matters, and misbehaving matters to push against the system and to create a feeling of urgency. And that's an uncomfortable space for many foundations to fund, but I think it's important for subsets of us to do that as well.
Thank you. Inequality, the number one emerging issue, most important issue, as you reported to CEP. I think the fight continues. I think it's encouraging. If we think of it as the long game, as many of you have said, I think it's encouraging that we have this sort of leadership in the thick of it with Hilary. We have emerging research and emerging insights through Raj. We have Kyle at the beginning. With a real clear focus and a North Star guiding him, and we've had...
And we have Tiffany showing that the quality of implementation
I'm working
matters.
You're kind. But I also want to also take this moment as we wrap up to recognize the shoulders we stand on and the leadership of Risa over the last decade and a half.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
We are in the last month of her leadership of RWJF, and as we think about social connectedness and social mobility and aspirations, you've been a leader I aspire to be, and we thank you. So thank you very much to the panel, and thanks for your attention this morning.
Great.